Hi, my name is Tara Houston, and I'm the Scenic Design Professor at LSU. I'm so glad to be able to share some of my work from a previous production of The Importance of Being Earnest. We're hoping that sharing my scenic design work with you will help provide some context for the show that we're staging this summer. The production I'm sharing with you was originally staged in March of 2015, directed by Jack Hefner, with costumes by Angela Baccaris and a lighting design by Ross Dennison. I served as the scenic designer and props designer on the show. To provide a little context, our show was set in the late 1890s, and specifically we were targeting 1895 as the date of our production. We visit 3 locations over the course of the show: Alfreds Flat, the garden at Jack's country home, and the sitting room in Jack's home. We see a group of upper-class friends and family kind of follow some hijinks through the country, and eventually see 2 couples fall in love and pledge to get married. It's interesting to think about the relevance of staging this play, both in 2015 and now. From an academic perspective, there are lots of reasons to do this show. Costumes and scenery from the upper class at this time were really sumptuous and beautiful, with lots of textures and patterns, complicated construction, and lots of possibilities to explore things from a technical perspective. In acting, not that I'm an expert, but in the acting realm, there's period styles work that is really important for our students, learning how to hold teacups and perch on the edge of chairs, how to work wearing corsets and in constricting clothes. All of these things are really valuable. So from an educational perspective, it's very easy to motivate this show. But looking at the world around us today, one might ask, what's the relevance of Importance of Being Earnest when we're grappling with a pandemic, where there are daily protests on the street? And for me, the answer is what the answer often is. Theater is an excellent form of entertainment. There are things to be learned from it, both as academics who work on productions and as artists who grapple with the themes and language that were delivered. But sometimes it's nice to watch a show in which everything works out the way we want it to, where the boy meets the girl and they fall in love, where jokes are witty and the language is quick. And we can, for a moment, be taken away from all of the chaos of everyday life and enjoy someone else's troubles instead of grappling with our own. And I think as we look around the world, we can find real value in a show that takes itself with such little seriousness, that feels trivial and sincere all at the same time. And I think for me, the real joy of working on Oscar Wilde is that the language is just so smart. What a funny writer, what incredible language, what fascinating characters he builds for us. They constantly skirt the line of stereotype and seriousness, and there's something that's really engaging about working with characters like that. So that kind of takes me into this next slide. I tend to like to kind of key in on some words that help inspire me to look for different characteristics in locations. And with each of our 3 locations here, I think that it's important to think about contrast as being a real important principle in how we grapple with these areas. So with Algernon, we really need to speak to the bohemian lifestyle, right? He's luxurious and exuberant and extravagant. He's youthful and fashionable. And there's something about those words that I think help us understand what that location should look like. In contrast, in the garden, we meet the young women for the first time and hear some of their thoughts about the world and what love means. And here, I think it's important that we really look at the kind of idyllic setting of a garden, and we think about the innocence of the women that we meet in that location. As worldly as they may be, there's still so much about the world that women at this time period were not allowed to interact with, that they were meant to be seen and not heard, that they were meant to be pretty more than they were meant to be smart. And in each of our characters, we see parts of each of those sides of the coin, but it plays best that we hear their wit and see their innocence all at the same time. And the contrast of a soft garden location after the luxuriousness of Algernon's location is a really interesting contrast to play with. So then in the drawing room at the end, where we start to see things get tied up, where the couples have agreed to marry one another and it feels like everything is turning out the way it's meant to be, there is some sense that there should be a sense of order being restored. That we find Ernest return to his identity, that we find true love, that we can continue a lifestyle that we were meant to live all along. And in that, I think it's important that the drawing room feel both authoritative but also pretty. That there are wonderful things happening in this space, that love is being realized in this space, but it's being realized in a way that all of the knots are untangled and a bow can be tied. So let's start by looking at Algernon's Flat. I was heavily inspired by a location called Leighton House, which is in Chelsea. It was designed by an artist who had traveled quite a bit through the East and collected trinkets and tiles and architectural pieces and sculptures along the way. He wanted to highlight them in a house that would be impressive to his friends. He also had a studio in this space. So it was his home, but also his workspace. And what we're seeing in these pictures are the entryway and then grand staircase. That rich blue color was really inspiring to me for a couple of reasons. First of all, Algernon's a bit of a peacock, so I thought it made great sense to use the peacock as the main inspiration for the color palette of his location. And then you'll see when we get to the production photos, the design for the set is heavily inspired by this entryway. For some additional looks into that space, the image on the left is from the studio itself, which painting with red walls is fascinating, a fascinating choice to me, but that is what Mr. Leighton chose to do. On the right side, we can see a couple of other locations. What I think is really interesting is that depending on where we were in the space, there were lots of kind of groups of trinkets and decor pieces, lots of paintings on the wall, and groupings of furniture that felt really tight and kind of busy. But then there are other rooms that are completely open that almost look like bathhouses in Turkey or something. And there's something to me that's really interesting about that use of clutter and space, the weight of things, and then the openness of space that was really interesting to play with on stage. So when we get to the design work for Algernon's Flat, you'll see that there is a sense of both openness and clutter that's trying to be captured there as a way to both explore the extravagance of his space, but also the chaos of Algernon's personality. Moving into the garden, I wanted to preserve that sense of grandeur, that Jack is a wealthy man with a large country home, that probably is an ancestral inheritance, right? So this is a family that's had some money and influence for a good deal of time. So there should be a sense of age and a sense of importance to all of this. And the pictures that we see here are also trying to capture a sense of femininity and softness at the same time. So you can see in the architecture for Algernon's space, things are very vertical and rectangular and feel more masculine in their lines. Here, things, even the architecture is softened a little bit by flowers. And I liked that sense of taking the edge off of the architecture and softening pieces. So in this next slide, you'll see the trellis at the top that's made out of rough cut lumber. I really loved that piece, as well as the tea setups with soft wicker furniture, so that all of the pieces have a bit of airiness to them and transparency to them and translucency to them, and that any roughened edge might be softened with something. So eventually our table was covered by a lace tablecloth, for example, when tea was served, just to soften those kinds of architectural edges from the furniture. The trellis was draped in blooming roses, so it softened the edges of things. And there were, some attempt to have foliage on all of the surfaces so that we had this sense of kind of blurred edges, if you will. Then moving into the drawing room, This room was really influential to us. You can see here the just like grandeur of the space. It's a really tall room. I would estimate that it's between 10 and 12 feet tall. And that height to me speaks to the strength and establishment of the expectations that these families have for the futures of these young men and women. That there is a sense that they have a duty to marry well and live good lives and better England and all of that sort of kind of colonialist stuff. So the drawing room for me speaks to the establishment. It speaks to power and influence and the role of the family in establishing the futures of these young people. But it's also the place that we find love amongst these couples, right? They flirt in the garden, but they agree to get married in the drawing room. There's a sense of romantic formality. And the striped fabric and soft pastel color palette kind of spoke to that. But I loved this undercurrent of it all being a bit about money in that everything is gold. So I think that is Lady Bracknell in a room, if you will. So here you can see the model and ground plan for Alfreds Flat. This is what we call a white model, meaning that I hadn't explored color yet, but we were looking at shape in the room and how we might find balance. The large structure on the stage right side, the wall that you see, is heavily inspired by the Leighton House. So you can see the columns are shaped in a very similar way, and the color palette was borrowed from that as well. The director liked the idea that we would suggest sort of 19th century British theater in our very neutral proscenium space. So there was a constructed frame, and you can see that downstage of that wall. And that was painted gold so that it had a bit of a picture frame sort of aesthetic to it that spoke to, the role of the artist in this show and that sort of the bohemian aesthetic that was certainly part of Oscar Wilde's character, but also the overall framing of this piece. This is what the production photo looks like. So you can see that there were two main furniture groupings that are sort of inspired by the research photos that we saw. And then the wall upstage is obviously influenced by Leighton House in that peacock color scheme. And it's difficult to see in the production photo here, but on that center table, there is a large vase that was filled with peacock feathers. And that was, my tip of the hat to the taxidermied peacock that lives in the entryway, the grand staircase of Leighton House. Moving into the garden, we have two main areas. There's kind of a seating group on the stage left side that was all wicker furniture. And then on the stage right side was a table and chairs for tea. There was a large hedge structure that was upstage of the tea table. And then the trellis that I mentioned from the research photos lived upstage of the wicker seating group. Here what we're looking at is, rather than the asymmetrical balance in Alfreds Flat, we're moving closer to a symmetrical balance, which to me was a journey towards legitimacy, that these young men who are kind of playing the town and presumably promiscuous, are going to be settled down, kind of domesticated by the women that they meet. So in the garden, it made sense to me to transition away from a bit of the asymmetrical balance that we see in Alfreds Flat before we get to the true symmetry that we arrive in for Act 3. Here's a production photo of that space, and you can see it's much more light and airy, also shorter than Alfreds Flat. And there what we're doing is sort of humanizing the women. We're giving them an opportunity to take the forefront of the stage here, and the scenery is really just a framing device, if nothing else. Moving into Act 3 in the drawing room, we return to a grand room. I thought it was really important to emphasize the height and grandeur and majesty of the space. And that was accomplished with two large windows surrounded by drapery, which was inspired by that research photo. And then you can see the furniture here is in symmetrical groupings. We have a pair of chairs and tables on each side of the stage with a couch in the center. And this is the production photo. Lady Bracknell is seated at center, and then we have the two couples on the outside seating groups. So that takes us through all of the work that I have to share with you. I hope it provides some context for the show that we're producing this summer. and gives you an idea of what London and surrounding areas in the late 1890s might have looked like.